So welcome and good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be having our second of our two statewide precision crop load management meetings. And this is being presented jointly by Cornell's Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program and the Lake Ontario Fruit Program. So here we are in our current state of the Precision Crop Load Management Program. So today we're going to be focusing on that second portion, the bloom thinning portion, and taking a deeper dive into the pollen tube growth model. So if you weren't able to join us last week for our pink meeting where we discussed adjusting flower load with precision pruning, and there we also talked about bloom thinning briefly, along with managing fire blight, insect management at pink. We do have that meeting recorded, and that is up on the Loft YouTube page, and we can go ahead and put that link into the chat box shortly.
All right.
Following this meeting, we'll be moving to a regional format so we can track the separate regions individually for our petal fall, 10 to 12 millimeter, etc. So keep an eye on your emails as we get into that timing for those dates.
Just a quick reminder, folks, to mute your computers and your phones, please. This is a Zoom. There you go, Mike. The slide. I'll let you take it away.
Was just about to get to that, but should have jumped in earlier. So just a reminder, if you can, please make sure you're muted throughout the meeting. We do get some feedback, particularly for those of you that might be joining in on your phone. You can do that at the bottom. You should be able to hover on your screen, and you should find this little toolbar. You just want to click that microphone and make sure you're muted, just to reduce the amount of feedback that we have. We also ask, just to conserve bandwidth, that you do keep your video off throughout the presentation portions of the meeting. And if you do have any questions as the presenters are going along, you can type those into the chat box, which again, you should be able to find on your tool. All right, so with that, I would like to thank our sponsors of this meeting, Valent USA, and their continued support of our programming. Valent USA is pleased to sponsor today's meeting and offers you solutions to grow better apples from bud to box. During the early season, remember Promelin for Typier Gala or frost rescue. For thinning, Amid Thin is now approved for use as a bloom thinner, and Pamaxa and Frutone are reliable NAA products for your thinning program. At the 8 to 10 millimeter timing, Maxell delivers excellent thinning activity and helps to improve fruit size by stimulating cell division early in fruit development. And finally, Provide Plant Growth Regulator can help improve fruit finish by reducing russet and scarf skin. Start your Provide program at early petal fall for best results. For more information about Valent products, please visit valent.com, budtobox.com, or contact Jim Margo. And we thank them again for their support. So again, without much to do, today's program, we will first be hearing from Dr. Terence Robinson as he talks about bloom thinning with and without the pollen tube growth model. Then we'll turn it over to Dan Olmstead, who will be discussing the updates that are coming to NUA 3.0. And then we're going to wrap up with a Q&A session so that everybody can get all their questions answered. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Robinson.
Good afternoon, folks. It's a pleasure to be with you again today. Everybody hear me okay, Mike Baisdow?
Yes, you're good, Terence. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'm going to talk today about mostly Western New York and to some extent the Champlain Valley. I'm not going to speak directly to the Hudson Valley situation because my presentation last week was geared to them since they're already in bloom. But hopefully there will be a few nuggets for Hudson Valley people in here about what's going to happen after bloom. Let's first look at the situation in Western New York, and it's really odd, but return bloom is very variable in Western New York. But in general, overall, bloom is less than optimum. And it's been an enigma to us as to why this is happening. Crop loads last year were not too high. But we did have a tremendous drought in June and July, which likely contributed to this lower than optimum return bloom. We did fruit counts or cluster counts at green tip, and we thought we had the right number, and we go back to those same trees at bloom, and there's many fewer blossoms than we thought initially. So that is a complication and is leading some people to question and wonder whether they should blossom thin. Just before the meeting, Mike Baisdow was commenting that there's a little bit of this same situation in the Champlain Valley. Now, I wish that I had the ability to get out and look at these orchards myself, but I'm not allowed to make those trips yet. And so I really appreciate all of the Western New York fruit team for providing me photos all over Western New York about what the bloom situation is. And I think I'm going to need some help, Dan Donahue, on that situation in the Hudson Valley before our next meeting in relation to what to do there. An additional problem that's come along is some frost damage. Now, we escaped, I think, generally in Western New York along the lake, the frosts of 10 days ago. And I think there's relatively little frost damage, but there are some sites that got down below 25 in the 24 and 23 range, where we would expect between 10 and 50% damage to king blossoms. Because I haven't been able to assess this myself, I want to make sure that people that are assessing blocks for bloom thinning look at whether the kings are viable by cutting them, pinching them through the middle and looking all the way down from the pistil to the base of the, where the stem attaches to the little fruitlet, whether it's all viable and green. As of today, the first king blossoms have opened across the Lake Ontario region. And there's surprisingly not a lot of difference in timing between the lake sites and the inland sites. The picture on the right is a Honeycrisp block in Wayne County that my technician took this morning. And when you look across that, there's 1 to 5 king flowers open on that tree as of noon today. But this tells us we're very close to needing to make decisions in relation to blossom thinning. I want to review the kinds of calculations that you need to have for your own orchard. Every person needs to calculate what their target number of fruits, final fruits after thinning is. I gave these same two examples last week. A typical mature tall spindle gala block can easily, routinely do 1,500 bushels to the acre. And if we're targeting 100 count fruits at the 3 by 11 spacing of 1,300 trees to the acre, it's about 113 fruits per tree. If you're 3 by 12, it's closer to 125 to 130 fruits per tree. But I want to emphasize that Honeycrisp is quite different. We have had trouble cropping it at the 1,500 bushel range, and so my target there is lower, only 1,200 bushels. That's still a high target and be able to get annual repeat bloom. Here, our fruit count size is larger, 80 count, and if you use those same 1,300 trees on a 3 by 11, it's only 73 fruits. Now, when we prune, we always leave some extra insurance buds, and so in Gala, we multiply that 113 by 1.5, and hopefully we're leaving 170 flowering spurs, less than 200 for sure. On Honeycrisp, though, because of the lower total yield we're looking for, with only 73 fruits, but we have a slightly higher factor, 1.8 buds per final fruit number. It comes out at 131 flowering spurs. But if you leave more than 200 flowering spurs on a Honeycrisp tree, you're asking for trouble in biennial bearing. And so the more we get into this, the more I want you to focus on this issue of not having too many flowering spurs. Now, many Honeycrisp blocks this year were low. So we would be 150 or even less than 100. And I'll comment about that number in just a minute. But if you have more than 150 flowering spurs, you should consider cutting some of those off. I also want to review why it's so important to do early thinning with Honeycrisp. It's because the flower initiation on Honeycrisp occurs very early in the season. The earliest variety that we've looked at, and this was work done by Pollyanna in her last 2 years here, but certainly with Honeycrisp, we start to see doming, which is this small picture on the right of the meristem, around early June. And so if bloom in Western New York is somewhere around the 5th of May, we would start to see doming by the 5th of June. And then it's all over with by about the end of June. And as a consequence, those small buds that are growing as the bore shoot on a spur or even on a new spur, the tip of that, once it starts to slow down and stop growing, which happens about petal fall on Honeycrisp or 10 millimeter, it's either going to become a fruit bud or it's not. What determines whether it becomes a fruit bud is how much gibberellin there is in the tree in that period of time, 10 millimeters, 12 millimeters, 20 millimeters. If there's a lot of gibberellin, it just stays a vegetative bud and stops growing. If the gibberellin level is low enough, then it will slow down and turn into a fruit bud and stop growing. But certainly by mid to late June, every shoot that's going to be a fruit bud next year has already stopped growing and has already been determined. As a consequence, we want to emphasize that it's critical to intervene early with Honeycrisp to get flower initiation. I reviewed last week this issue with gibberellins produced in the young seeds. They're also produced in shoot tips, but excessive number of shoot tips on Honeycrisp is not usually a problem. It's the seed number. When we have too many seeds, all that gibberellin is inhibiting the flower bud transition from a vegetative bud to a floral bud, and then it stops growing and remains a vegetative bud until next year. So the earlier that the fruit number can be reduced to close to the target number, the greater likelihood we can have of that bud being floral next year. And I gave these two examples last week, but I want to repeat them. If you did the proper job of pruning and pruned to this 130 initial buds for a tall spindle 3 by 11 that's mature, you initially would have 5 flowers in each cluster. And so that would be a total, in 10 seeds in each fruit, you'd have about 6,500 seeds. If you stick with the left-hand side of this little table, if we blossom thinned and we did a super job and we knocked off all the laterals in the cluster and we were left with just the king, which is what our goal is, we would come down to 130 fruits times 10 seeds. That's 1,300 seeds per tree. That's a manageable number. But the other side of the column shows what happens when you prune too lightly and there's too many buds and you have more than 200. In this case, I chose 250 initial flower clusters. And I go back to what I said earlier. If you currently have more than 150 flower clusters on Honeycrisp, you're in trouble already for next year. And you should probably go out and try to cut some of them off to get the number down, because once those seeds start producing gibberellin, they're doing damage to you for next year. But continuing this example with 250 initial buds, you start at bloom with 12,500 seeds. Now let's assume you don't do much bloom thinning and you maybe put on a petal fall spray, but not much thinning. You carry those 12,500 seeds until the 10 millimeter stage. Then suppose at 10 millimeter, you get it down. You still have gone for several weeks with 12,000 seeds on that tree. Even if you could get it down to 1 fruit per cluster by thinning at 10 millimeters, plus your hand thinning, you're still carrying 2,500 seeds, which is too many. And this is why we really push blossom thinning with Honeycrisp. Now, the question is coming up repeatedly because of the issues that I mentioned in my first slide. Should I blossom thin or not in 2021? It seems like every year it's one issue or another. It's never like the perfect year. I'm sure there are a few perfect blossom thinning years in 10, maybe 2 or 3 in 10, but there's often one issue or another. Last year, it was substantial king blossom damage. And I went back to my slides from last year and saw where we were talking about if there's flower damage more than X amount, don't do this and that. I also want to repeat some of that this year, although I believe, without seeing with my own eyes, that the king flower damage is much, much less in 2021 than it was in 2020. But I again emphasize that each block has to be assessed separately, looking at king flowers and determining whether they're viable and they look healthy. We're at a perfect time to do that. You can also do it at full bloom. But before you put on any blossom spray, I would like you to make sure in your own mind how much flower damage, king flower damage there is. If it's less than 40%, then I think blossom thinning is still justified, especially with Honeycrisp, Fuji, and Gala. Honeycrisp and Fuji, where we're trying to control biennial bearing, but Gala, where we're trying to maximize fruit size. But if king flower damage is greater than 40%, I don't personally think blossom thinning is justified. I think that we just try to manage what's left with post-bloom thinning and hand thinning. I'd like to focus on this third point under bullet point number 1, and that concerns the total number of flower clusters on Honeycrisp trees. If you're already low on flower cluster numbers and you're close to the target, then flower thinning, blossom thinning is not needed this year. If we go to our example where we were trying to shoot for 73 fruits per tree, if you go count some trees and you're already at 100 or less, I don't think there's any need for blossom thinning. But if you're above 100, 120, 150, 180, 200, I think blossom thinning is still justified and can be very, very useful to you to avoid biennial bearing. So I come back to this issue, assess each block, because I don't think there's that much frost damage, but there's variable blossom numbers. And Craig has been helping me on several projects, and he's run into this issue with trying to find the right Honeycrisp block, and then seems like there's not that many. So please make sure you know how many clusters you have per tree and how close it is already to the target. A second question you can ask yourself is, should I use ATS, which is the only legal caustic thinner we have, or use one of the 2 hormone type thinners that has a label, which are either NAA or NAD? To me, ATS is a better option using the Pollen Tube Growth Model. So I would say that where king flower damage is minimal, I would use ATS. And so where I have 70, 80% of the kings still alive, and I've got enough kings, much more than my target, I would use ATS. But if you have significant king flower damage, then I would switch to NAA or NAD. 2 other cautions. Where there has been frost damage, often the bottom of the tree is damaged more than the top, and I would completely turn off the bottom nozzles, even for the blossom thinning spray. Now, normally we do not want to turn the bottom nozzles off on a blossom thinning spray because I'll say in a minute, the reason why we have to have a uniform distribution of that ATS chemical. Lastly, don't use surfactants with ATS. With the NA, it's not that big a deal. I wouldn't mind using Regulate if that's your tradition, but not oil. And then you have to consider the issue of strep and what we're facing with fire blight. So let me go forward then to have some specific suggestions for using ATS. I think it's essential with this product to use the Pollen Tube Growth Model, and I really commend Greg for bringing it to New York and the whole NUA team for getting it in such a wonderful user-friendly format. My suggestion is to measure the style length of 20 king flowers by removing the petals but not the sepals, using this picture on the right to guide how you measure its style length. If you strip away all the sepals or you cut vertically down through that flower, you might measure way to the base of the fruit itself, and that would be way too long. And then when you have an excessively long style length in your model, it tells you to wait too long to spray, and then you miss affecting any of the fruits you're trying to knock off. One of the most important things is to determine the moment in time, and I use the word moment intentionally, like the hour, the minute, when enough king flowers are open to match the target number you want. Remember that with tall spindle Honeycrisp, it's somewhere around 70 to 100. If you're at 3 foot by 11, it's 73 fruits. If you're at 3 by 12, it's closer to 90 fruits, but somewhere between 70 and 100 flowers are open is when you would say this is the moment to start the model. With Gala, we're looking for more fruits on a tree, and so when you would have between 100 and 130 king flowers open, then you would start the model. So starting the model is fairly simple, and I'm hoping that Dan Olmsted will walk you through it a little bit later. I'll show you just a figure of what the output looks like, but you tell it an hour of the day to start. Then my suggestion is that we spray ATS before the model gets to 100. Now, this is a little bit of a controversial recommendation, but I've had too many failures with waiting to spray ATS until the pollen tube growth model gets to 100. And this is what I think is happening. Lime sulfur, which is the most common product used in the West, is a more caustic material on pistils and styles in the flower. And I think it basically kills the style all the way almost to the top of the fruit itself. But ATS seems to be less caustic. It has to burn, but it burns the pistil tip, the stigma, and part of the style, but it doesn't reach far enough down the style to kill pollen tube growth, pollen tubes that are growing more than 60 to 80% of the way down. And so if you wait to 100%, you get more pollen tubes fertilizing flowers than what you thought you were, and you end up with not enough thinning and sometimes almost no thinning out of it. We've done 2 years of looking at this. It still indicates that we should be spraying before 100% when you're using ATS. You choose 60, 70, 80%. I like 60%. I've never had over thinning with it. But we're doing more detailed studies this year and hope to have a more science-based recommendation for next year. But once you spray the first spray at either 60 or 70 or 80% of the pollen tube growth model, then you put that into the model and it will restart and then start calculating again how pollen tubes are growing after that spray on a new flowers that open the day after the spray. And I would suggest you spray a second time when you reach either 60, 70, or 80% of the model again. Now, one caveat. If you have a situation where some of your kings are damaged, and either you see the damage by shortened pistils or black or brown when you cut down through it, then not every king that's opening is going to make a fruit. So you should wait till more flowers open, sort of insurance flowers, before starting the pollen tube growth model clock. How many should you let open? Well, just for discussion, let's say that your target was 100 gala flowers. You would normally start the clock when 100 king flowers are open. But when some are damaged, if 30% are damaged, I'd wait another 30% and wait till 130 flowers are open. That might only be a matter of a few hours on a warm day. But on a cool period, it might be the difference between spraying one day versus the next. Now, to finish up with ATS, let me review with you what ATS does. ATS burns the stigma of the pistil. That's the tip where the pollen tube lands and part of the style. Thus, only the droplets that actually hit the pistil and the style cause thinning. Droplets that land on leaves don't do any thinning, or that land on wood. Yes, the ATS is absorbed by the leaves, and we see that effect by some marginal leaf burning from the tips, but that's not causing the thinning. The thing that's causing the thinning is to get that molecule or droplet of water right on the pistil itself. Because of that, we want to use a relatively good volume of water. Now, at this time of year, you don't need 200 gallons, but I like to use between 80 and 100 gallons of water. And I want to emphasize that the actual concentration in the tank is what's important. If you use tree row volume calculations and adjust for the tree row volume, you might end up with a higher concentration. You would end up with a higher concentration in the tank and get too much burning of the leaves. My recommended rate, and the only ones I feel comfortable, are between 2 and 2.5%. That means for every 100 gallons in your sprayer, you're going to put either 2 gallons or 2.5 gallons of ATS. So on a 500 gallon sprayer, you're going to put either 10 gallons or what's 2.5 times 5? 12.5 gallons of ATS, but never more than that. Now, my suggestion, which I said last week, and I'll repeat, if we have relatively cool temperatures, I like the higher rate. So if temperatures are warm, above 75, use the lower of the two rates. I don't think this year we're going to have warm temperatures. I think it's all going to be cool. So when temperatures are below 75 for that day and the next day, use the higher rate of 2.5%. Now, because the molecules of water have to land on the pistils, we want a uniform spray pattern with equal nozzle distribution from the top to the bottom. The old standard for thinners of 2/3 in the top and 1/3 in the bottom do not apply to caustic thinners. And I like to use a relatively good volume of water. Now, ATS, when it's absorbed by the leaf, separate from its thinning effect, causes leaf margin burning, leaf phytotoxicity, but it does not seem to cause fruit finish at the rates that I've recommended. So I actually like to see some leaf margin burning to know that I sprayed the product right. If I don't see any leaf margin burning, I wonder whether the rate was even reasonable to cause thinning. And then lastly, one application, if you go this route with ATS, one application is never enough. You have to run the model a second time and spray a second time. If the bloom is extremely protracted and we have a lot of bloom on 1-year wood that comes out way late, you're going to need a third application. Now, with each application, you can start the model over again after a particular application. It'll tell you when to apply the next one, and then you start over and when to apply the third one. But remember this, with increasing number of applications, there's increasing leaf phytotoxicity. And so I love to get by with 2, but I don't think that's going to be possible this year because of the cool forecasted weather. I think this is the best option where we've got reasonable blossom numbers. But if you are worried and you just feel like maybe it's not for you this year, hormone type thinners are also a very viable option. With these, precise timing is not important. We're suggesting what is defined as full bloom. And the strict definition of full bloom is 80% of the blossoms, meaning 4 out of every flowers in every cluster are open. That's ignoring the lateral bloom on 1-year wood when you determine full bloom. So when 80% of all the flowers on the spurs are open, that is full bloom. And that's when we would suggest you spray the hormone type thinners. Now, it's not that critical, the timing. You can spray a little earlier, a little later. With this one, we don't need such high spray volumes because we're depending on the hormone being absorbed by the leaves and having its influence inside the plant, not by burning the pistil. So we can spray 50 gallons the acre, or we can spray 100 gallons the acre, whatever you choose, or something in between. But we do need to adjust the dosage in the tank for tree row volume to give a dilute equivalent spray. And I've been through that many, many times with you all, but just to quickly say it again, if you're putting on less than the required volume of water, you have to adjust up the chemical for an equal ratio so that the total micrograms of chemical that the tree receives or the acre receives is the same as it should be with a dilute spray. There are 2 legal options. Now, I've been trying to get Maxell labeled at bloom, but it's not labeled yet because it's quite inconsistent. And in fact, in cool years, it doesn't work. So it's not labeled at bloom. The 2 products that are labeled at bloom are NAA and NAD. And there's several formulations of NAA. They all work similarly. A good thing about both of them is they're very safe thinners when used at bloom. In fact, sometimes we see very little thinning. They're very mild. Even when you spray them at 10 parts per million for NAA or 35 or 30 parts per million with NAD. So they can be sprayed safely at high rates. So if you're spraying half the water and you want 4 ounces per 100, but now you have to double it, you might have 8 ounces in the tank because of tree row volume, but it's still safe. We've measured photosynthesis many years back, and NAA does reduce photosynthesis when applied at 10 millimeters, and that's one of the ways it helps to thin. But at bloom, it has very little impact on photosynthesis. But we have seen in repeated studies that it does help return bloom with Honeycrisp as long as the seed number is not way too high. If the seed number is way too high, there's nothing you do that helps because of all that gibberellin I talked about earlier. But where gibberellin levels are moderate because you've got the pruning right and seed numbers are not too high, this balance of the NAA helps to balance the GA and counteract the GA to allow those bud tips to convert to doming for floral buds instead of staying vegetative. NAD traditionally has not been used at bloom. It's been a petal fall spray, but it's now labeled at bloom, and our studies show we get equal response, assuming that we're using more than double the amount of NAD as we do NAA. And so I would almost say they're interchangeable in terms of safety and in terms of utility and benefits. So what would we conclude this year? I think that there's still many blocks that would justify an ATS program, but it can best be done using the pollen tube growth model as precisely as you can. What it does, it basically prevents fertilization of the 3 or 4 lateral flowers in every cluster, leaving only the king. And wouldn't it be great to finish bloom and only have 1 fruit in every cluster? It's also very good if you put on that 3rd spray at knocking off almost all the bloom on 1-year wood, which we don't want anyway. If things work perfectly and you time it right, you can end up in just the enviable situation of 1 fruit per cluster. And assuming you pruned right, you have very little thinning left to do. You still have some because of the insurance buds we left, but it's not a difficult job after that. Plus, you'll be more assured of having return bloom. 2 last cautions. ATS is a caustic thinner. And so slow drying and wet conditions mean that there's more uptake of this and more burning of leaves and burning of pistils. So it's wonderful to apply it under dry conditions where it can be absorbed and dried, and then that's it. This repeated mists and light rains right after application make it a more risky thing. Secondly, if there's frost, then there's a risk of damaging the fruit. Now, what frost does, it damages, if it didn't kill the fruit, it damages the epidermal cells of the fruit, and so they can't make enough new wax. And as the fruit expands, there's little gaps between the wax platelets. And when you get the ATS on that fruit between the wax platelets that no longer meet because there was some damage, they cause russet. The fruit responds by creating another barrier called suberin, which is essentially russeting. So I would say this year it's going to be a little bit dicey because of the rain forecasted in Western New York. I still think that many of you should try ATS on some blocks, but be careful and watch out for these issues of frost and slow wet drying conditions. Now, I wanted to just throw up one example. We're not in enough bloom at Geneva to run this model properly, but I just used the theoretical scenario. Let's say that today, Monday, at noon, I went out and I counted on our Honeycrisp trees that we had 75 or 80 king flowers open. So I start the model. It would show that by this afternoon at 4 o'clock, we've progressed 6%, or the styles, because the bees were flying today. So we would assume pollen landed within a few hours and we're already at 6%. It's forecasted to slow down through the night, and then tomorrow with relatively warm, it'll jump a lot. And this model would indicate that May 5th, Wednesday, about 8 a.m., we would get about to 60% on the model. So somewhere, but then it's going to go up slowly and only reach 75% by 5 that evening. So on Wednesday, if it weren't raining, we would spray sometime 8 in the morning, 10 in the morning, noon in the morning, noon in the daytime. It won't get to 100 until a couple of days later. But this is the way I would use the model. Now, everybody who's used this often complains that it requires precise timing of application, and that's true. And then it's not possible sometimes. The forecast looks like that we're going to have rain most of the day Wednesday, so it wouldn't be possible. But luckily, we're not enough bloom yet, so we have to wait until tomorrow or even the next day to count enough flower clusters open to start the model. But I just wanted to show you how this would work and how I would do it. When the model gets to around 60% is when I would start spraying. So if I start my block at 8 a.m. and it takes me 6 hours to cover, it'll be 2 p.m. before I can get the block covered. And so we'll be between the 60 and the 75% on the model with all of the places we spray. So my take-home suggestions are you to review, assess every block, because there's often not enough flower clusters out there with some Honeycrisp blocks. Also, there could be king damage. I want to make sure you cut kings and look for damage. If the total flower damage is more than some number, you decide blossom thinning is not important this year. I do want to get us prepared for what will happen right after that. So we will probably have a petal fall meeting, but I want to just prep you for it that almost all blocks will need a petal fall spray. And I would like you to try to time that based on degree days, base 4 degrees C or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the carbohydrate model. Now the carbohydrate model will have a new look, and Dan might talk about that, but it will have a column for degree days, the base that we need in fruit physiology, not the base of insects. And so when you see that forecasted to get close to 100 to 125, try to time your petal fall thinning spray in that window. It's often a few days after your insecticide petal fall spray. After that spray goes on, you need to assess the response by measuring fruit growth rate. This requires you to measure fruits twice, and we're going to suggest that you measure at 50 degree days after that first spray, and then 125 degrees after that first spray, and then decide if you need a last spray at 12 millimeters. Now, if bloom thinning worked perfect, plus a petal fall spray, you could be done. And you'd be done early enough that there wouldn't be excessive GAs, and you'd get good return bloom on Honeycrisp when you add the return bloom sprays we'll talk about later. If it doesn't work, you still have the option at 12 to 13 millimeters. And we want you to time those based on degree days, reuse the measurements of fruit growth rate, and then apply, if needed, a final spray. I don't think we're going to need that 4th spray much this year. I also want to emphasize, wherever there's been frost damage, don't apply thinners to the bottom half of the tree, and don't put surfactants in your thinning program. Now, with that, I want to make a comment about strep sprays. We're looking at probably having big problems with fire blight and needing at least 2 and maybe 3 or more strep sprays. Some of those strep sprays may coincide with your ATS. If you mix, you can mix strep and ATS as long as you do not put Regulate with it. Well, let me just go back. Now, Regulate is always an important component of a strep spray because it helps get it in. And Surgeon Simovic in the Hudson Valley used to talk about, which he's really the one who talked about it the most, this giving strep some kickback action. So if you're just a slight bit late on your strep, normally we say it has to be sprayed within 24 hours, a slight bit late. The addition of Regulate gives you kickback. But the problem is the Regulate will make the ATS more toxic to the plant. You'll get more phytotoxicity, and you might get more thinning than you want. So if you mix ATS and strep, you have to leave the Regulate or oil out. Now, I do want to give you this small consolation prize, and that is ATS acts as a penetrant as well. So it will help give strep some kickback. How much kickback, I don't know. But I don't want you to use Regulate if ATS and strep are mixed. Now, if you choose to use the hormone type thinners, NAA, you can mix the Regulate with the strep. So NAA, strep, and Regulate are fine. Now, normally I don't like to put Regulate with NAA, but at this timing, NAA is so safe that the Regulate won't make any big difference. It will maybe just help you get a slight greater amount of thinning. So just remember those 2 cautions. No Regulate with ATS if you put strep with it, but if you're using hormone type bloom thinning, you can put strep and the Regulate in the same tank. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to talk more later in the question and answer, but I'll turn it back to you, Craig.
All right. Thanks so much, Terence. I think for for the sake of time, I'm going to turn things over to Dan Olmsted now. And we do have questions in the chat box, but we'll save those for the end at the Q&A.
Great. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here. I'm glad to be able to contribute to this conversation. So to follow up with what Dr. Robinson was discussing, I want to basically provide a really quick overview to some of the big changes you're probably starting to hear about, but then I really want to focus on new resources that are available for pollen tube growth in particular. And if there's time, I can pull up the apple carbohydrate thinning model as well. But to get things started, everybody should be able to see my shared screen. The first thing I want to do is point out a new support resource. And this is really important moving forward because we have so many changes that have happened with NUA that it's been really important for the team who has been developing this to make sure we're providing kind of the nuts and bolts support to make everybody successful this year. So if you go to nua.zendesk.com, and I'll put some links right in the chat box in just a moment, I want to point out in particular two categories. So there's this one called Getting Started with NUA, and then we have Apple Tools. So getting started with NUA, we have a lot of new features available, and really to get the most out of the pollen tube growth model and carbohydrate and even apple thinning, it's going to be worth the time. I think it's maybe 20 minutes max to go through these. And what I've done is I've created quick start tutorials. And so for each one, it's going to tell you exactly what you need to do to get started. How do I sign up for an account? How do I add models to my profile? And then finally, how do I start getting around once I'm logged in? So if you give me just one moment, I'm going to put those links in the chat. And while I'm doing that, I'll also add that the Lake Ontario Fruit Team just published a newsletter that has a really good article in it with all of the resources that you need to get started here. So I'm going to post that. And feel free to start poking around if you want as I continue talking. Now, the next thing I'm going to post are some links to the pollen tube growth model. And then again, I'm adding it now. This coming Friday, by the end of the day, I'm going to have one of these quick start guides available specifically for this model. So it's just a walkthrough. Where do I go to do everything? You know, how do I get started quickly, and so on and so forth. So in that spirit, what I want to do now is just show you what we've been working on, how to create blocks, how to save your settings, and so on and so forth. So what we have here, if you go to dev.nua.cornell.edu, you're going to find a fully functional development site. So we have maybe 90% of all the models done that are going to be transferred over from the existing website into the new one. What you see here is the basic page that you get after you've logged in, after you've gone through those 3 steps. And you can see that there's not much happening here. That's because we haven't added the information yet. By default, I'm going to use Geneva, one of our NYS IPM weather stations here in the Finger Lakes region. And I'm just going to create a block, much as we do with the old model, but I'm also going to go through and show you some of the improvements, how you can edit, and so on and so forth. So assuming you've done all those steps, you simply need to create a block by clicking here on the left-hand side, and you're going to get this really easy interface. So I'm just going to put in some pretend information. I'm going to try to approximate something maybe that Terence was just talking about. But we can always take questions afterwards, and the folks who have the expertise can certainly jump in at any time. So I'm just going to call this block A for the name. There was a question in the chat about available varieties. So we have these 7 or 8, I think it's 7 actually. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to choose Gala. And then I'm just going to use an average style length value of maybe I'll just say 9. It might not be accurate. Again, I'm not the expert, but I'm just showing the nuts and bolts. So now we have that basic information. You can scroll up and down, and I'm going to choose a start date. So this is when you feel that enough of those blossoms are out. I think I will go with maybe April 29th. And on the right-hand side, you can see that this model is very precise. You can choose the hour of the day. So I think just for this, I'll choose 12 p.m. to demonstrate. And for now, we'll come back to this. I'm going to hit create, and we'll give it a moment to load. And you can see that we now have information about block A. This is what I just created. So immediately you've got some summary information. You can see that we're at 84%, assuming an April 29, 12 p.m. start date of accumulation. If I scroll down further, you can see the accumulation graph, and this should look pretty familiar if you've used the older Pollen Tube Growth Model. So you can see that you can track at where everything is as we're going through time. And I think for this demonstration, we'll try to target 70%. So that should be right in that range there. And to do that, you simply come back up here to where it says block A and go to the right-hand side. You're going to see this little icon. It's a pencil icon where it says edit block. If you hover over it, you're going to click on that, and now you're back to your interface. So I want to add a first spray. And I think it was, let's see, let's just try May 1st, and we'll say 5 p.m. It might not be exact, but you're going to see what happens here. So let's let that load. And now you can see at this exact point in time, that first spray was applied. Now I am a little bit early. So if I want to change that, it's certainly not set in stone. Let's go back here. And I think I'll choose maybe 2100 hours on May 2nd. So back up here, I'm going to click here. May 2nd, 2100 hours is actually 9 p.m. And I'm choosing the wrong one. So let me cancel out of this for a moment and go back to that first spray. And as you can see, it's very easy to make changes. You're not going to break anything. We've done a lot of user experience and input from growers and extension folks. So let's add that and now see if we can get closer. Yeah, that looks more like it. So now we've passed that 60% threshold, and now the model has reset. You can do this up to 3 times. There was also some mention of that. So again, as you go through the thinning season, when you get to that second spray, you simply add that information as needed. And then once that second spray is added, a third spray then becomes an option. The really neat thing is that with a user profile account, all of this information that you're adding is going to be saved permanently unless you choose to delete block A, for example. The last thing I'll do, though, is that you're not limited to a single block. You can choose as many as you want. So very, very quickly, I'll just add a second one for demonstration purposes. Maybe we'll choose a different variety here. I'll just say 10 millimeters as an example. And actually, while I'm thinking of it, this is where you're going to be measuring your own style lengths and deriving the average on your own. You're only entering a single value in this new model. And that was kind of to simplify the input, but just something to remember. And again, we'll just add a start date. We create the model, and now let this load. And what should happen is that you'll see a second block here. I'm not going to go back and fix this now, but you have an option to choose whatever blocks you want. You can save as many as you want, and you get output in a summary format. The last thing I'll add is that if we go back to block A here, you'll see that I've got a start date, but now it's showing that we're at first spray, and this is how far along we are in the first spray. I want to go over some of the other features. So we have a growth table that's basically a formatted version of what you're seeing visually here. We have date, we have air temperature, we have hourly growth in millimeters, and then we have accumulated growth and then percent of target. So again, this up here, the graph is just a visualization of what we're seeing in this table output. One of the last features I'll mention before I show you the last bits here is that if you don't want to see the graph, you can turn it off. So you'll see that I just toggled that off. You can toggle it back on if you want, and you can do that with any of these elements. So if you really are a person who just wants to see the table at a glance, you can do that. You can download these results for your records as a CSV formatted file. It's something that's compatible with Microsoft Excel. So from whatever date you see that's listed last year, from the start of your model, it's going to download all this information, and you can do your own record keeping or analysis or anything like that. The last part of this is an hourly temperature graph, and you can also download this along with that graph I showed you earlier as a PNG file. So for extension folks, that's obviously useful, but I know growers are sometimes interested in also having that information. So that kind of covers the main parts of this model. Again, remember that we have a whole bunch of resources that are available to get you started quickly. On my part, I'm the nuts and bolts person. You know, if you have a problem and something just doesn't seem to be working, we have our NUA help desk. You can send an email or you can fill out an online form. That's usually the quickest way to get a response. But we also have our extension teams, and we have the folks, Greg Peck and Terence Robinson here, who have the expertise to certainly inform the biological side of things and provide that context, especially in a season like this where it's cold and rainy and whatnot. So I don't want to go on and on about this. My idea is to maybe leave time for questions. If people are interested in looking very quickly at the carbohydrate model, I'm happy to do that. But maybe I'll turn it back over right now to Mike and Craig to kind of get a feel for where we should go here.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Dan. Really like the new look of the new website. I think what we'll go ahead and do, since we are just short on time, why don't we go ahead and start addressing the questions that are coming into the chat box, if that works for you.
Yep, we appreciate Greg answering a lot of questions already on the chat box. There's, I think, one maybe directed towards Terence from Motugas. Are the temp considerations important when using NAA at bloom as they are later, or as important at bloom as they are later?
Yes. It's a hormone type thinner, so it works best in warmer temperatures. And one of the reasons it's often a mediocre, very mild thinner at bloom is temperatures are cooler. But we've also studied this in our massive 17-year study. And the tree is not as sensitive. Even if you have warm temperatures at bloom, it does work better, but it will never overthin. So that's why I say it's a very, very safe thinner at bloom. But warmer temperatures are better than colder, as with NA at any time.
Thank you. I think that's it in the chat box for now.
We did have a few more that came in, and thanks again to Greg for answering those. Just for the sake of the recording, I do just want to repeat them. Roger had asked if Gala and Honeycrisp were the only ones that we were able to blossom thin. Greg did respond that there are a number of different models. So Golden Delicious, Gala, Fuji, Pink Lady, Honeycrisp, Granny Smith, Red Delicious, all have models. And an additional universal model is also in the works, but is not currently available.
And you can bloom thin on other varieties as well. We don't have the empirically derived pollen tube growth model for those varieties. So growers are kind of left to play around with different varieties and come up with a timing based on maybe trying a few varieties, or if you know the, if you know that it's similar in past experience to one of the existing models, and you can go with that.
And we also had the other question, how different are the pollen tube growth rates by varieties? And then also the follow-up of how different pollenizer varieties change the growth rate. Greg, did you want to address that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, so there are differences, and it could mean hours or even up to a day difference in the pollen tube growth rate. And so it makes a difference. That's why we decided to come up with the different models. And then there's also a question about pollen source, and that can also, we did a study on that a number of years ago, that can also affect the rates. We used snowdrift which is a common crabapple pollenizer, for the model, so we could have a baseline. But when we tested other crabapple pollenizers, we found some to be faster than snowdrift, like Indian Summer, Thunderchild. It's really hard, and as I mentioned, in a lot of this modeling, and bloom thinning was really focused on Washington State because they were the ones who were really keen on it at the time. And I'm really excited that our East Coast growers are now getting on board with it, because for all the reasons that Terence pointed out, it's incredibly useful physiologically for biennial bearing. But our orchards are a little more complicated, right? We have a lot more varieties, and we have a lot more varieties close to each other as opposed to large blocks of one or two varieties. So it's hard to know where your pollen source is. So if you know, and you can compare it to some of the existing data that's out there, you can make some adjustments. Otherwise, I think the pollen tube model becomes a guide for us and helps us to say, we're at a point where we should start thinking about our window for a bloom thinning spray. And I think one of the things I'll also point out, not mentioned in here, is that the model we've developed for Washington, we did a lot of testing when I was working in Virginia under a warm climate. Some work that we've done in New York also found that the model can underpredict pollen tube growth in cool conditions. And so this is a year where we have cool conditions during bloom. And so Terence's recommendations of looking to somewhere between 60 to 80% of the style length, the pollen tubes growing 60 to 80% of the style length, I think is actually critical for this year to make sure that you don't miss your target.
All right, thank you, Greg. Another question that I think you addressed somewhat in the chat box, again, if you wanted to expand more on, can we expect additional increased return bloom if crop load is only marginally decreased, but seed counts are significantly decreased?
Yeah, and Terence covered this pretty well. We know that the earlier that you remove the fruit, particularly, thinking about it in terms of the seeds and the gibberellins the seeds are producing, we know that return bloom can be positively impacted for the following season. And some years we did not see a major difference in fruit size in the current year, but we did see an increase in return bloom the next. As Terence also mentioned, other factors, drought conditions, other stresses on the tree can affect return bloom. So it's not 100% of the time, but it was the majority of the time that happened.
Just to follow up on that for the whole group, just as far as data goes for return bloom, do we have a sense, average year, your return bloom using ATS versus perhaps NAA or NAD, what those differences might look like?
I think it has less to do with the specific chemistry than the amount of thinning that those chemistries caused. I don't know if Terence, if you have anything to add to that.
You're basically right. Our data shows that if ATS is applied correctly and we get some thinning, it combined with the petal fall and 10 millimeter sprays will generally give between 60 and 80% return bloom. We in fact don't want 100% return bloom on Honeycrisp because that just sets us up for biennial bearing. So 60 to 70% return bloom is ideal. With NAA, we sometimes, or many times, we'll see a bump up to 30 to 50% return bloom. So it often is not quite as good as ATS, but it much depends on whether the NAA gives us any thinning. And so we all, like Greg said, we see increased return bloom even when it's cool and NAA doesn't thin at bloom. It still helps return bloom, but not quite as much as ATS. So if you're worried, use it, at least use NAA, but I think the ATS is a better product or better approach for getting return bloom. Now, we just anecdotally, last year, one of our important growers decided against ATS for all the reasons we talked about, some damage to kinks, and they've been very happy with the NAA results that they put on at bloom.
Great, thank you, Terence. We do have another question. Is the new NUA going to replace the Malusim app?
Not exactly. So NUA is a Cornell-owned website. And with the Malusim app, which we developed with New York Farm Viability Institute funding, it's a private app that I guess I own. I'm part of Cornell, but it's not essentially part of NUA. Now we try to work hand in glove. So essentially the Malusim phone app or the Malusim website, which I own, essentially sends data to NUA and then gets the results from NUA and gives it back to you. So we're really still using NUA. So I've worked with both the NUA group, particularly Keith Eggleston this year, to update the carbohydrate model and the fruit growth rate model with two important additions that I'll talk about at a future meeting. But at the same time, the Malusim app is also being updated to reflect these additions that I put in both the carbohydrate model and the fruit growth rate model. So they should give exactly the same results. You use whichever one you think is most easy to use. Now for the phone app, when you're entering fruit diameter data, the phone app allows you to verbally say those and record with voice recognition. And so that's a help. Not many people use it, but I think it's a real help. It makes it a one-person job. It also can return the results very quickly, and it has some new error detection protocols in it. Now, we don't have a version of the fruit growth rate model on NUA. And maybe we should try to do that for people who want to use the older spreadsheet version. But I'm not supporting the spreadsheet version this year because it requires me to review every single spreadsheet and check for errors. It's just too much effort. But the new error detection protocols we have in the phone app will solve, I think, 99% of the error problems. Hopefully that answered your question, Jim.
All right, great. Thank you, Terrence. Are there any other questions? Feel free to go ahead and type them into the chat box, or if you'd like, you can click on the reactions and raise your hand and you can ask them directly. I'll just give everyone a minute to figure that out or type some more questions in.
I have two comments I'll just add while people are thinking about their questions. One is, in my experience, growers often worry very much so about overthinning. I think more often, when you think about it, you probably underthin more often than you overthin. So just keep that in mind. I'm not, saying that it doesn't happen to overthin, but it seems like there's so much emphasis on overthinning, whereas I think we run into a lot of issues with underthinning, particularly with the biennial bearing varieties and those with small fruit size. And so it's a mentality thing. And then the other is, if you're an organic grower, and there's a handful on this call, I know, even though this may not be the ideal year for bloom thinning, it's really your best shot at getting your crop load right. And so I still would suggest that the organic growers really consider bloom thinning this year, even under less than ideal conditions. You can use other products like lime sulfur post bloom, but that's very label specific, and I think there's a lot of restrictions on that.
All right, thanks, Greg. We do have another question coming in from Will. What should we apply?
Yep. Let me just add on to Greg's point.
Sure.
We have a problem in New York that we've been unable to get the lime sulfur companies to approve a label change allowing us to apply it at bloom. They're afraid of a lawsuit. But for organic growers, that is the best option. Lime sulfur and fish oil is the only really good option for organic growers. ATS is not allowed. But Greg's point is important. When we first did lime sulfur work, we sprayed it at various times of bloom and then again at petal fall and then a week after petal fall. It does have action at petal fall, and it's legal to spray at petal fall. Now, I would much prefer to spray it at bloom and use a pollen tube growth model, but we're caught in a weird regulatory issue. And I wish that, at least in consideration of the organic growers, we could get some emergency relaxation from DEC on that point. And I'm sure Greg's going to work on that. But I do want to say you can still get thinning at petal fall with lime sulfur and fish oil.
All right, thank you, Terence. So the next question we have is from Will. What should we apply to wild twist that seems to be going biennial? Does anybody have any experience with that variety at this point?
So I have never worked with wild twist, and it's one of my failings. We're just planting our first trees now, so I can't really give definitive answer. But it is a daughter or son, I don't know what you call a daughter or son of Honeycrisp. And as a consequence, I think it would respond similarly to Honeycrisp. Now, it would be very interesting for us to repeat some of Pollyanna's work and look at when flower initiation happens with that variety. But if it happens early like Honeycrisp, then you got to have some blossom thinning approach with wild twist. And I would suggest with not one trial, that ATS at bloom would probably be my best option. If you're afraid of that for whatever reason, NA at bloom. And then again, another strong dose of petal fall of NA and 7. But I don't even know how hard it is to thin that variety because I've never worked with it.
I don't have any experience with wild twist.
All right, thank you. Do you want to hedge your bets and recommend trialing it with either the Honeycrisp or the Pink Lady Pollen Tube Growth Model?
This is Jim Eve, and I work with Hess Brothers Blown Wild Twist. And generally, we think it thins similarly to a MAC, but it does have a tendency to not reflower as well as we like. And I'm thinking what Terence is thinking, all of the Honeycrisp parentage is probably destined to have something done at bloom.
So thanks, Jim. I think that's a great help because I just am flying blind. But if it thins easier than Honeycrisp, now I got to go back and tell this story. When Honeycrisp was first started, we thought it thinned easy. But if Honeycrisp settles down and becomes weak, it's not so easy to thin. And I did years and years of work up at Shazy Orchards, and we just couldn't thin it unless we went really early at petal fall and at bloom. So maybe wild twist thins easier, but it's still going to need a shot of ATS at bloom to get that repeat bloom. And so that would be my best guess at the moment.
All right, great. Thank you, Terence. We did have another question from Kyle. Many other effective caustic materials, any Eastern research with potassium bicarbonate, oxidate, straight fish oil, botanicals, etc.?
So I've not tested potassium bicarbonate oxidate, but I have tested straight fish oil, and I have not, Greg's tested, shoot, why does the name escape me? That other blossom thinning product?
Regalia.
Regalia.
Yeah.
And it's worked, but straight fish oil has not worked.
Yeah, the oil is actually helpful to get the material into the plant, but it on itself is a mild, if any, bloom thinning effect on its own. So it's not the active part of that combination. There has been a lot of research on different bloom thinning materials, just straight, even table salt, right? And so, you know, potassium chloride, calcium chloride has been tried. Anything that's caustic has the potential to be a bloom thinner, but it can cause other negative effects. And also remember that there are very strict labeling guidelines as to what you can apply to an orchard. So we're kind of caught in what is available and what we can recommend for that. In our experience, it's been the products that Terence has already gone over that are most effective. And I would definitely add Regalia to the mix. Although, again, that's being applied. You know, our research, we published a paper on this and found it to be an effective way of controlling cedar apple rust. And we also got some bloom thinning efficacy at that same timing.
I would quickly add that we tested urea back in the day, and we could get very little thinning out of urea. You would think, since ammonium thiosulfate's a nitrogen fertilizer, maybe urea could give us similarly, but no. There's something about that sulfur molecule in ammonium thiosulfate that gives us the caustic part, not just the nitrogen.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll give people another minute. I did have one more. Terence, you had mentioned under slow drying conditions, our risk of increased leaf phyto, and I would assume as well, just more activity from the material. Do you think that under really quick drying times, would we expect less efficacy out of the caustic thinners?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a little less efficacy, but I don't think it's a big reduction, because what we're really trying to burn is just that pistil, and it's very sensitive. And so it doesn't need a lot of time to burn it. Leaf margins take more time because there's a leaf cuticle. And so when you have slow drying conditions, you just get more pulled into that leaf and it burns more of the leaf margin. But on the pistils, I think it takes just a matter of seconds.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, just let me add one last comment here, which is the slow dry, the other negative issue with lime sulfur, even more so than ATS, is russeting under slow drying conditions, fruit russeting. And so that's another thing to consider for this next stretch of pretty cool weather. And we've seen that warm, wet weather is the worst, but you could get some russeting from the cool, wet weather as well.
All right, thank you. All right, well, not seeing any other questions, I think we'll call it a day. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us again. And I'd like to thank Valent as well for sponsoring this meeting. And again, we will have this recording up in the next day or two, and that will be at the same location on the Loft website, along with our pink meeting. And please stay tuned, keep checking your emails as we go to our regional follow-up meetings for the petal fall, 12 millimeter and beyond. So thank you for joining us today.